delighted to be joined today by Professor Paul Fletcher, who is a consultant psychiatrist in CPFT and Professor of Health Neuroscience at Cambridge University. Paul, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And your lecture today is on the topic of video games and psychiatry. And what a fascinating field. What topics are you going to focus on?
Well, I'm actually going to cover it from three different angles. So in the first instance, I want to consider the fact that video games often get a very bad press, unjustifiably so in my view. That's in particular in relation to the questions over whether violent video games can cause violent behaviours. So I want to examine the evidence for that, as well as the evidence that violent games might actually be addictive. And the conclusion I'll draw is actually that the evidence is very, very poor generally, and that we really shouldn't be coming to hasty or premature conclusions on that. In the second part, I want to be more positive, and I want to think about just what an amazing new art form video games are, and what they might offer us, both as people and as scientists, in terms of their ability to represent and immerse you in different experiences. And how if we're sensible about this and engage with games makers, we can actually harness this power very usefully. And the third part, I want to give my own experience of working with members of the CPFT Recovery College and a local video game design studio called Ninja Theory, in making a game that was set up to represent the experiences of mental illness, and particularly of hearing voices and seeing visions. And I'd like to present that as a very positive experience, both for me and in terms of the ultimate product, which I think had a big impact on people who played it.
Thank you. Some people might think that this whole topic is a bit trivial for a professor at Cambridge University. What would you say to those people?
Well, I think there's a natural tendency to see games as essentially leisure pursuits, relaxation, things that you do when you're not being serious. But to an extent, I think there's nothing wrong with that. They give a lot of people a lot of pleasure, including myself. But what I'd really like to think about is, firstly, should we be worried about any harm they might do? I think that's a very important question. But also not to lose sight of the fact that they can be extended beyond being a simple pastime into something that very powerfully represents mental states, including mental distress, and also can become a setting in which we can perhaps ultimately even create therapeutic inputs, or at least scientific measurements.
What do you think the state of the field is as regards illness, sort of gaming illnesses? There are various attempts. Some people are interested in trying to make new mental illness categories of addictions to gaming. What's your take on that?
Well, so far the enshrinement of negative aspects of video games in relation to psychiatry has been about whether they're addictive or not. And there are certainly a relatively small number of people who do struggle with the amount that they play, and they feel compelled to play, and they feel distress when they stop playing. And I think that needs to be taken very seriously. And it's been included in existing diagnostic texts and manuals. But my view actually is, if you look at the literature and weigh it up with an unbiased mind, it's premature to think that we have really defined a new syndrome. And there are many reasons why people play video games of different types and for different amounts of time and with different patterns. And I think to simply label that all as, say, an addiction or a disorder is premature and potentially problematic.
And the other topic that you already touched on is this relationship to violence. And again, what's your take on how mature and robust that area of scientific inquiry is?
Well, I think there are two levels of inquiry or debate. There's the general media-led debate, which usually happens when there has been a tragic event such as a high school shooting, and then it's a deeply worrying level of debate because it's based largely on anecdotes and half-truths, and it may well be that people who engage in these sorts of acts of violence do play violent video games, but lots of people play violent video games and don't engage in these acts. And lots of people who do engage in these acts don't play violent video games. So I think at that level, it's worryingly premature. The science, I think if you review it overall, there is no emergent pattern. So some studies show that aggression levels go up when you play violent video games. Some studies show that they don't change, some that they go down. A lot of it is to do with the prior conceptions of the experimenter. And a number of people have complained actually that the science has become very partisan. And I think with the growing tendency across psychological science to be much more careful about our hypotheses, about pre-registering our ideas, replicating our findings, I think that more open approach is going to actually settle a few questions more satisfactorily than the existing science does.
Thank you. And one of the things that you've mentioned and that a lot of people are interested in is this wonderful collaboration that you and CPFT have had with video game developers. Can you tell us about that, please?
Sure. So that was a real joy and has produced a product that we're all very, very proud of. The original idea was from the local video game studio, Ninja Theory, who contacted me out of the blue a few years ago and asked me if I could help them because they wanted to try and represent a person who hears voices and suffers from severe mental distress within the context of a video game. And one thing that really struck me about them was they were very keen to hear from people who had lived experience of this because they wanted to make the game as respectful and accurate as they could. And I was very fortunate to be in contact with a number of people with lived experience from the CPFT Recovery College, and they and the CPFT as a whole really supported this enterprise from the start and invested a lot of their own time, a lot of their experience in meeting and talking about the issues that were being dealt with in the game. And the consequence of that was a really unique representation of mental illness that has been widely distributed and widely praised by people internationally. So we're very proud of the impact that's had.
I think one thing that I've taken from talking to you and your work on this area is a much more nuanced view of video games. Is that something that you'd endorse, really, that these caricatures and stereotypes? I think I've fallen victim to that in the past, of just thinking they're a waste of time and a negative thing. Is that something that you'd really like to present, this more nuanced view?
Yes, I think that captures it nicely. I think there are games that I would never play that I find uncomfortable in their violence, in their representation. But this is a maturing art form, and I think it can no longer be categorized as a simple style of pastime. There are so many different things that people are trying to achieve in video games, whether that's representing mental illness, representing emotions, the human condition, thinking about, even adolescent development. The games are no longer a homogeneous entity, if they ever were. And so I think it demands, if we're going to engage with them properly and also capitalize on what they can offer us, I think we do need a very nuanced view.
Thank you very much.